Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we really dig into complex sources to pull out the essential knowledge you need. Today, we are tackling a truly massive topic, one that really shaped the entire 20th century, World War I.
Yeah, it's huge. And it's a conflict that people at the time knew was different. I mean, they started calling it the Great War, or even the World War right away, like in 1914.
That early. Wow.
Absolutely. And its scale, just the sheer horror of it, led to that, well, that tragic but kind of hopeful phrase, the war to end war.
Which sadly, it wasn't. It ran from July 28, 1914 to November 11, 1918. So what is that, 4 years, 3 months, give or take?
Exactly. 4 years, 3 months, and 14 days that just fundamentally rewired, the world.
And the cost, it's almost, well, it's hard to really wrap your head around it. Our sources point to over 9 million military deaths straight off.
Yeah, it's something like 5.5 million plus for the Allies, over 4.3 million for the Central Powers. But that's just the soldiers in uniform.
Right, because when you add in civilian casualties, people displaced, dying from famine or disease linked to the war, the estimates shoot up, don't they?
They really do. Historians talk about a total toll closer to 30 million people. It's staggering.
Staggering. And there's this other dimension, too, which often gets, maybe not overlooked, but less emphasized.
You mean the Spanish flu?
Exactly. The timing is just horrific. The war ends, and bam, this deadly pandemic sweeps the globe.
And it's not just timing. The sources are pretty clear that the war itself was a massive accelerator. Think about it.
Yeah.
Millions of people crammed together, trenches, camps, troop ships.
Terrible conditions.
Awful. Perfect breeding grounds. And then you move these huge numbers of potentially infected people all around the planet. The war basically created the highway for the pandemic. Massive dislocation, weakened immune systems. It was a perfect storm.
That combination, war and plague, it really underscores the sheer scale of the global disruption we're talking about.
It really does.
So our mission today, then, is to go beyond just, the assassination in Sarajevo and the mud of the Western Front. We want to unpack the deeper stuff.
Right. The long-term geopolitical forces, the tensions that built up for decades, the things that made the whole system so fragile.
And then how did that specific spark, the July crisis, actually ignite the whole thing? How did the technology of war change so drastically?
And the consequences, of course.
Yeah.
The peace treaties, this redrawn map, the seeds of future conflict, it's all connected.
Okay, let's dive in. Where do we start to understand how Europe got so unstable in the first place? What was the foundation?
Well, you really have to go back further than 1914. Think about the 19th century. For a long time, Europe had this system called the Concert of Europe.
That was about maintaining balance, right, after Napoleon.
Exactly. A sort of equilibrium among the major powers. But that got seriously disrupted around 1871. Two big things happened. The rise of a unified German empire after the Franco-Prussian War.
Which was a huge shift in power right in the center of Europe.
A massive shift. And at the same time, you have the slow, steady decline of the Ottoman Empire in the southeast. So the old balance was just gone.
And that Franco-Prussian War left a really deep scar, didn't it? Especially in France.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned revanchism. French policy after 1871 was, well, heavily influenced by this desire for revenge against Germany. It wasn't just about politics, it was cultural.
They'd lost Alsace-Lorraine.
Right. Key territories, rich in resources. They became these powerful symbols of national humiliation. So almost any interaction with Germany after that was viewed through this lens of, one day we'll get it back.
So you've got Germany rising, the Ottomans declining, France wanting revenge. That sounds like a recipe for trouble.
It was, and it pushed everyone towards locking themselves into these defensive alliances, the famous web of alliances.
Okay, so you had the Triple Alliance on one side, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. That was formed back in 1882.
Correct. And then kind of opposing them, you have the Triple Entente. Now, this wasn't quite a formal military alliance in the same way, more like a set of cooperative agreements.
That was France, Russia, and the UK, right?
Right.
Through things like the Entente Cordiale in 1904.
Exactly. The Entente Cordiale between Britain and France, and then the Anglo-Russian Convention in 1907 brought Russia into that alignment.
But looking at these alliances on paper, how strong were they really? Were they ironclad guarantees?
That's the fascinating part. They look solid, but underneath, not so much. Take the Triple Alliance. Our sources highlight this secret deal Italy made.
Italy, what did they do?
Well, back in 1902, so more than a decade before the war, Italy secretly agreed with France that they'd stay neutral if Germany attacked France.
Wait, so Italy, a member of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary, basically promised France they wouldn't help their own allies.
Pretty much, yeah. It effectively nullified their commitment within the Triple Alliance, at least regarding an attack on France initiated by Germany.
So why did Germany and Austria even count on Italy then? Were they just ignoring this wishful thinking?
I think it was a bit of both.
Yeah.
Maybe some denial, maybe they thought they could persuade Italy when push came to shove. But fundamentally, it shows how shaky these alliances could be. They were meant to deter war.
But they ended up being transmission belts for it.
Exactly. Instead of guaranteeing peace, they made it almost inevitable that a small conflict would drag everyone in. They became instruments of escalation, not stability.
And fueling all this tension alongside the alliances was this massive arms race.
A terrifying arms race, yeah. Huge increases in military spending, driven by technology and, frankly, paranoia. The most obvious example is probably the Anglo-German naval race.
Right. Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted a German navy that could challenge Britain's Royal Navy, which had ruled the waves for centuries.
He did. It was a huge departure from Bismarck's earlier, more cautious foreign policy, which always tried not to provoke Britain. Wilhelm wanted Germany to have its place in the sun, and a big navy was part of that vision.
And this race had a pivotal moment, didn't it, with one specific ship?
HMS Dreadnought.
Yeah.
Launched in 1906. You really can't overstate its impact.
What made it so revolutionary?
It had two key things. All big guns of the same caliber, allowing for better fire control, and steam turbine engines, making it much faster. In an instant, Dreadnought made every single battleship afloat, including Germany's brand new ones, basically obsolete.
So all that money Germany had already spent, kind of wasted.
Essentially, yes. They'd poured fortunes into building a fleet, and suddenly the British had leapfrogged them technologically. Now Germany had to spend even more enormous sums just to try and catch up to this new standard.
So strategically, it was a disaster for Germany.
A massive strategic blunder. They spent enough to guarantee Britain would see them as a threat and likely join any war against them, but they never invested enough to actually beat the Royal Navy.
And did that failure lead them to shift focus?
It did. Around 1911, 1912, Germany realized the naval race was probably unwinnable, or at least too costly. They initiated what's called the Rüstungswende, basically, an armament turning. They pivoted back to focusing massive investment on the army.
Why the army specifically?
Fear of Russia. Simple as that. After its defeat by Japan in 1905, Russia started recovering economically and militarily much faster than anyone expected.
And they were building railways.
Crucially, yes. They were rapidly expanding their railway network, especially near Germany's eastern border. Now, German war planning, like the famous Schlieffen Plan, depended entirely on being able to mobilize faster than Russia.
To compensate for Russia's massive population advantage.
Exactly. So Russia building railways that could speed up its mobilization, that was seen in Berlin as an existential threat. They felt their window of opportunity, their speed advantage, was closing fast.
And you can see this in the spending figures, can't you?
Oh yeah. The numbers are stark. Military spending by the six big European powers: Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Italy went up by over 50% in real terms, just between 1908 and 1913.
Everyone was getting ready.
Everyone was actively preparing for a major war. The atmosphere was incredibly tense.
And the place where all these tensions seemed to converge, the real flashpoint, was the Balkans.
The powder keg of Europe, as it was famously called. And the key destabilizing factor there was the continuing decline of the Ottoman Empire.
The sick man of Europe.
Right. As the Ottomans weakened, everyone else, Russia, Austria-Hungary, the newly independent Balkan states themselves, saw opportunities to gain territory or influence.
Russia saw itself as the protector of the Slavs, didn't it? Like Serbia.
It did, but Russian policy was actually quite complex. They wanted influence, sure, but they were also wary of a really strong Slavic state, like an expanded Serbia, controlling the strategically vital Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits. Ironically, they sometimes preferred a weak Ottoman Empire controlling the straits to a strong, ambitious Balkan power.
So it wasn't simple, and this region just kept erupting, didn't it?
Crisis after crisis. You had the Bosnian crisis in 1908-1909, where Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. That massively angered Serbia and Russia.
Because Serbia saw Bosnia as rightfully theirs, or at least destined for a greater Serbia?
Exactly. And many Bosnians were Serbs. Then you had the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913. These wars basically kicked the Ottomans almost entirely out of Europe, but they also led to Serbia nearly doubling in size and becoming much more powerful and assertive.
Which, for Austria-Hungary, must have been terrifying.
Absolutely existential. Remember, Austria-Hungary was this huge multi-ethnic empire with lots of its own Slavic populations: Czechs, Slovaks, Croats, Slovenes, Poles, Ukrainians, and Serbs. A strong nationalistic Serbia right on its border, acting as a magnet for South Slav loyalty. Vienna saw that as a direct threat to the empire's very survival.
So nationalism, declining empires, competing ambitions, rigid alliances, an arms race. The stage was well and truly set.
Perfectly set. All it needed was a spark.
And that spark came on June 28th, 1914 in Sarajevo.
Yes. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie were assassinated during a visit to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia.
The assassin was Gavrilo Princip. He was a Bosnian Serb, part of a group called Young Bosnia.
That's right. And critically, our sources confirm Princip and his collaborators were supplied with weapons and training by Serbian nationalist extremists, specifically elements within a shadowy group called the Black Hand, which had ties to Serbian military intelligence.
Now, the immediate reaction in Vienna, it's interesting. One source we looked at said the news almost failed to make any impression whatsoever initially.
It is surprising, isn't it?
Yeah.
You'd expect immediate outrage, maybe spontaneous grief. But it seems, at first, it didn't quite register as this empire-shattering event.
But that changed quickly.
Very quickly. As historian Christopher Clark puts it, officials in Vienna soon realized this was an opportunity. They saw the assassination not just as a tragedy, but as a pretext. Clark calls it a 9/11 effect. A terrorist act loaded with historical meaning that could completely change the political chemistry.
Change it in what way?
To finally deal with Serbia, they saw this as the perfect justification to crush Serbian nationalism and interference in Bosnia once and for all. They weren't looking for justice. They were looking for a reason to go to war.
And that led to the diplomatic maneuvering in July 1914, the so-called July Crisis. Austria issues an ultimatum to Serbia.
On July 23rd. And this ultimatum, when you read it, it's clearly designed to be impossible for Serbia to accept fully.
It had 10 demands, but some were particularly provocative, weren't they?
Absolutely. The most crucial ones demanded that Serbia allow Austrian officials to operate on Serbian soil to suppress anti-Austrian groups and even participate in the investigation into the assassination.
That's a direct violation of sovereignty. No independent nation could really accept that.
Precisely. Serbia actually gave a very conciliatory reply. They mobilized their army, but agreed to almost all the demands except those specific points about Austrian officials operating within Serbia.
But that wasn't good enough for Austria.
Not at all. Austria immediately declared the reply unsatisfactory, broke off diplomatic relations, and crucially declared war on Serbia on July 28, 1914.
So the first domino falls. And then the alliance system kicks in, just as feared.
Exactly. Russia saw itself as Serbia's protector. Facing Austria's declaration of war, Russia began to mobilize its massive army along the Austrian border on July 30th.
Now, Germany's role here is critical. They were allied with Austria-Hungary.
Yes, and they had given Austria what's known as the blank check earlier in July, basically promising full support for whatever Austria decided to do about Serbia. But Germany played the timing quite carefully.
How so?
They actually delayed their own mobilization until July 31st. They wanted Russia to mobilize first so they could frame Russia as the aggressor. This was really important for public opinion back home in Germany, especially to get the socialist parties to support the war effort.
So they wait for Russia to mobilize, then they demand Russia stop.
Right. Russia refuses. So Germany declares war on Russia on August 1st. And because of their war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, war with Russia automatically meant war with France, Russia's ally. So Germany declares war on France 2 days later on August 3rd.
Okay, so Austria, Serbia, Russia, Germany, France are all in. What about the UK?
Britain's entry is the final piece, and it hinges on Belgium. Britain, going way back to the 1839 Treaty of London, had formally guaranteed Belgium's neutrality.
And Germany's war plan, the Schlieffen Plan.
Absolutely required German armies to march through neutral Belgium to attack France from the north. It was the cornerstone of their strategy for a quick victory.
Did Germany think Britain would just ignore the treaty?
The German chancellor famously dismissed the treaty as a scrap of paper. They seriously miscalculated Britain's commitment, or perhaps Britain's willingness to use it as a reason to enter the war against a rival power. When German troops crossed into Belgium on August 4th, Britain issued an ultimatum demanding they withdraw. Germany refused.
And Britain declared war.
Britain declared war. The conflict was now truly continental, And with Britain involved, it became global because of the British Empire.
While all these declarations are happening, what's going on back in the Balkans on the ground?
The violence starts almost immediately, even before the major armies clash. In places like Sarajevo and across Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, Austro-Hungarian territory with large Serb populations, authorities actively encouraged anti-Serb riots.
So neighbor turning against neighbor.
Yes, often fueled by existing tensions and actively stoked by the authorities. Our sources mention thousands of prominent Serbs being arrested, over 5,500, and estimates of up to 2,200 executed. They even used special militias like the predominantly Bosniak Schutzkorps to carry out some of these actions.
A brutal start. And the initial Austrian military campaign against Serbia itself.
It was a disaster for Austria. Despite the chaos and the size difference, the Serbian army, battle-hardened from the Balkan Wars, inflicted stunning defeats on the invading Austrians in August 1914 at the battles of Sur and Kolubara.
Really? An upset victory.
A major upset victory, one of the biggest of the 20th century, arguably. And it had huge strategic importance. It forced Austria-Hungary to divert significant forces to the Serbian front throughout 1914, weakening their efforts against Russia on the much larger Eastern Front. Serbia's resistance really mattered.
Okay, so the war is global. Germany's grand strategy, the Schlieffen Plan, was all about avoiding a long two-front war by knocking France out quickly.
Within 6 weeks, that was the idea, before Russia could fully mobilize its huge army.
But it didn't work. The plan failed. Why? What went wrong?
Well, several things. The plan itself had been modified from the original by the German Chief of Staff, Moltke the Younger. Schlieffen's original concept was incredibly bold, a massive right hook through Belgium, with almost all the forces concentrated there.
Moltke weakened that right hook, didn't he?
He did. He shifted troops to strengthen the left flank in Alsace-Lorraine, partly out of caution, partly for political reasons. This arguably made the crucial right wing too weak to deliver the knockout blow.
And then there were decisions made on the ground during the advance.
Yes. As the German First Army under von Kluck approached Terrace, he made a critical decision. Fearing his flank was exposed, he turned inward, southeast of Paris, instead of continuing the planned wide sweep around the city.
And that created an opening.
A fatal gap. It opened up a space between his army and the German Second Army. The French, along with the small but professional British Expeditionary Force, BEF, spotted this gap and launched a desperate counterattack.
The First Battle of the Marne.
The First Battle of the Marne, early September 1914. It halted the German advance. It wasn't a total rout, but it was a decisive strategic defeat for Germany. The chance for a quick victory was gone.
And the realization must have set in quickly.
It did. There's that chilling quote attributed to the German Crown Prince Wilhelm around that time, supposedly saying to an American reporter, "We have lost the war. It will go on for a long time, but lost it is already." He saw that the two-front war Germany dreaded was now inevitable.
So after the Marne, both sides tried to outflank each other, heading north towards the coast.
Right, the so-called race to the sea. Neither side could outflank the other, and the result was this continuous line of trenches digging in, stretching all the way from the English Channel down to the Swiss border, about 400 miles.
The Western Front's stalemate. And you can even see their strategic thinking in how they built the trenches, can't you?
You really can. German trenches were generally much better constructed from the start, often deeper, more reinforced, sometimes with concrete, better bunkers.
Why? Because they knew they were stuck there.
Basically, yes. They accepted the reality as a long defensive war in the West while they dealt with Russia. The Allies, on the other hand, especially initially, tended to build less permanent trenches.
Because they still believed they could break through.
Exactly. They kept thinking their trenches were just temporary positions, holding the line until the next big offensive would finally restore mobile warfare. That belief cost countless lives.
And it led to this horrifying mismatch. Old tactics against new defensive tech.
Precisely. You had generals ordering massed infantry assaults, soldiers advancing shoulder to shoulder, basically 19th century tactics.
Straight into 20th century defensive firepower. Machine guns in concrete pillboxes, miles of barbed wire, and incredibly powerful, accurate artillery.
The result was industrialized slaughter on an unprecedented scale.
And when the offensives failed, they looked for technological solutions, sometimes horrific ones.
Like chemical warfare. The Germans first used chlorine gas on a large scale at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. It caused panic and broke the Allied line initially.
Which was a violation of international treaties, right? The Hague Convention.
It was. And while gas ultimately didn't prove decisive countermeasures like gas masks were developed, winds were unpredictable. Its psychological impact was enormous. It became one of the most feared aspects of the war.
How many casualties are attributed to gas?
The estimates are around 1.3 million casualties overall, maybe 90,000 fatalities. But the terror it inspired went far beyond the numbers.
But offensive technology eventually started to catch up, didn't it? By later in the war.
Slowly, yes. The British pioneered the tank, starting with prototypes like Little Willie. The idea was an armored vehicle that could cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and attack machine gun posts.
Did they work well initially?
They had lots of problems. Mechanical breakdowns, slow speed, vulnerability. But by 1917, 1918, used en masse and coordinated with infantry and artillery, they started to make a difference in breaking this stalemate.
You mentioned artillery earlier. That changed dramatically, too.
Hugely. Probably the most important tactical innovation. Artillery shifted from mostly direct fire, where you could see the target, to sophisticated indirect fire.
How did that work?
Using maps, mathematics, and, crucially, new communication methods. Spotter aircraft or observers on the ground could use field telephones to relay target coordinates back to gun batteries miles behind the lines.
So they could hit targets they couldn't even see?
Exactly. And they could concentrate fire from hundreds of guns onto a small area with devastating accuracy. This ability to deliver massed, precise artillery fire became the key to both defense and offense on the Western Front.
But trying to break through these defenses, even with new tech, led to these battles of attrition with unimaginable costs. Verdun in 1916.
Verdun, a 10-month meat grinder. The Germans intended to bleed France white. It became this symbol of French determination, the they shall not pass spirit. But the cost? Estimates range from 700,000 up to nearly 1 million total casualties on both sides.
Just horrific. And the Somme, also in 1916.
The Somme is infamous, especially for the British. That first day, July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered 57,500 casualties.
57,000 in one day.
In one day. It remains the single bloodiest day in British military history. The total battle lasted months and cost the British around 420,000 casualties, the French 200,000, and the Germans maybe 500,000. Over 1 million casualties from minimal territorial gains.
It forces you to ask, what were the commanders thinking? Did they truly believe this was the only way, or were they just trapped in this mindset of attrition?
That's a debate historians still grapple with. Was it incompetence, stubbornness, or a grim acceptance that this was the terrible price of industrialized warfare? Probably a mixture of all three.
And even if you survived the shelling and the attacks, the trenches themselves were deadly.
Absolutely. Disease was rampant. Trench foot, caused by constant wet and cold, could lead to gangrene and amputation. Typhus, spread by lice, was a major killer, especially on the Eastern Front. One source mentioned it killed 200,000 people in Serbia alone back in 1914.
Plus dysentery, influenza.
Exactly. The battlefield wasn't just a killing zone. It was a breeding ground for disease, amplifying the suffering and contributing to that later Spanish flu pandemic we talked about. It was death from shells, bullets, gas, and germs.
While the Western Front gets a lot of attention for that static trench warfare, the war was obviously global, and other fronts were often much more fluid. Let's look at the Eastern Front.
Right, the fighting between Germany and Austria-Hungary on one side and Russia on the other. This was a vast theater of war, characterized by huge distances, sweeping maneuvers, and enormous armies.
Russia surprised Germany with how fast they mobilized initially, didn't they?
They did. They attacked into East Prussia within about 15 days, much quicker than the Schlieffen Plan had anticipated. This forced Germany to pull troops away from the Western Front, right at that critical moment of the Battle of the Marne. Arguably, Russia's speed helped save France early on.
But that speed came at a cost for Russia.
It did. The Russian army was enormous, the famous Russian steamroller, but it lacked the heavy artillery, the logistical support, the industrial base to sustain a long, modern war. They suffered huge losses and devastating defeats early on, like the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, which essentially destroyed a Russian army and drove them out of Germany.
Yet they kept fighting for years. Was there a point where Russia seemed to be gaining the upper hand?
There was a major moment in 1916, the Brusilov Offensive. General Alexei Brusilov launched this massive attack against the Austro-Hungarian lines in Galicia using innovative tactics.
What was different about it?
Instead of one huge, predictable bombardment on a narrow front, Brusilov used short, intense barrages across a very wide front, followed by surprise infantry attacks at multiple points. It shattered the Austrian lines.
How successful was it?
Initially, incredibly successful. It was perhaps the most successful Allied offensive of the entire war in terms of territory gained and prisoners taken. It caused panic in the Central Powers.
And it had wider effects.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It forced the Germans to pull vital troops away from the Battle of Verdun in the west to bail out the Austrians. It relieved pressure on the Italian front, and it finally convinced Romania to join the Allies, hoping to gain territory from Austria-Hungary.
But it sounds like there was a downside, too.
A massive downside. The offensive cost the Russian army maybe 1 million casualties. And while it devastated the Austro-Hungarian army, it also bled the Russian army white. It used up Russia's last reserves of trained manpower and material, fueling the growing discontent and exhaustion back home that would explode into revolution the following year. Brusilov's success paradoxically hastened Russia's collapse.
Okay, let's shift focus to the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers later in 1914. Why was that significant?
Hugely significant. It opened up entirely new fronts. Suddenly, Russia was threatened in the Caucasus region. And critically for Britain, the Ottomans threatened the Suez Canal in Egypt.
The lifeline to India and the rest of the British Empire.
Exactly. Protecting the Suez Canal became a top British priority. The Ottomans also controlled the Dardanelles Straits, cutting off the easiest sea route for the Western Allies to supply Russia.
The Ottoman entry didn't start well for them militarily, did it, in the Caucasus?
No, it was a disaster. Enver Pasha, the Ottoman leader, launched this ambitious winter offensive against the Russians in the Caucasus Mountains at Sarikamish in December 1914. It was poorly planned. Soldiers weren't equipped for the extreme cold. They lost something like 86% of their army, mostly to frostbite and disease.
Wow. But the Allies had their own disasters in the Ottoman theater, like Gallipoli.
Gallipoli, yes. The 1915 attempt by Britain and France, heavily involving Australian and New Zealand troops, the Anzacs to force the Dardanelles Straits and capture Constantinople. It was a bloody failure. Huge casualties on both sides.
But elsewhere in the Middle East, the British eventually had more success.
They did. British imperial forces, often using troops from India, advanced through Mesopotamia, capturing Baghdad in 1917. And another campaign pushed across the Sinai Desert into Palestine, eventually capturing Jerusalem. Figures like T.E. Lawrence of Arabia were involved in supporting the Arab revolt against the Ottomans there.
This theater also saw one of the darkest events of the war, didn't it?
Yes, the Armenian Genocide. Starting in 1915, the Ottoman government, under the cover of war, initiated systematic deportations and massacres of its Armenian Christian population.
They claimed it was a security measure.
That was the pretext, that Armenians were potentially disloyal or collaborating with Russia. But the scale and brutality forced marches into the desert. Mass killings led historians to classify it as genocide. Estimates are around 1.5 million Armenians died. Similar atrocities were also committed against other Christian groups like Assyrians and Greeks.
And Turkey still denies it was genocide today.
Officially, yes. It remains a deeply contentious issue.
Okay, let's move to another from the Italian front. Italy started in the Triple Alliance but switched sides.
They did. In 1915, Italy joined the Allies, tempted by promises of gaining Austro-Hungarian territory after the war areas like Trentino and Istria down the Adriatic coast.
What was the fighting like there? It's sometimes called the White War, isn't it?
Yes, because so much of it took place high up in the Alps and the Dolomites. The geography was just nightmarish for warfare.
Trenches and mountains.
Literally. Soldiers had to hack trenches out of rock and ice. Fighting often happened at incredibly high altitudes. Avalanches were a constant danger, sometimes killing more men than the enemy. Supply was a logistical nightmare.
And the Italian commander, Cadorna, he had a reputation.
A terrible reputation. Luigi Cadorna believed solely in the mass frontal assault. He launched 12 major battles along the Isonzo River between 1915 and 1917.
12 battles in the same place.
Basically, yes. Trying to break through the Austrian mountain defenses, they gained almost no ground, but suffered horrific casualties, something like 500,000 Italian combat deaths during the war, many of them in these futile Isonzo offensives.
Did the front ever break?
It did, but initially against the Italians. In 1917, a combined German-Austrian offensive at Caporetto utterly shattered the Italian lines, causing a massive retreat. It almost knocked Italy out of the war.
But they recovered.
They regrouped with Allied help along the Piave River, and then right at the end of the war, in late October 1918, the Italians launched their own final offensive at Vittorio Veneto. This time, the Austro-Hungarian army, already disintegrating from internal nationalist pressures, just collapsed. That victory essentially ended the war on the Italian front and precipitated the final breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Lastly, let's touch on the war at sea beyond the dreadnought effect. Germany tried commerce raiding.
Early on, yes. Ships like the SMS Emden had some spectacular successes sinking Allied merchant ships around the globe. But the Royal Navy's dominance was too great. The surface raiders were hunted down fairly quickly.
So Britain controlled the surface, and they used that control to blockade Germany.
A naval blockade, yes. It was hugely controversial. Britain declared the North Sea a military area, mined international waters, and stopped and searched neutral ships heading for Germany, seizing goods they considered contraband, including food.
Which arguably violated international law at the time.
It did, but it was incredibly effective. Over time, the blockade caused severe shortages of food and essential raw materials inside Germany and Austria-Hungary, contributing significantly to domestic unrest and weakening their war effort.
And Germany's response to the blockade led directly to U.S. entry, didn't it?
It did. Their main weapon against the blockade was the U-boat, the submarine. Initially, they tried to follow prize rules warning ships before sinking them. But to be truly effective against the British blockade, they felt they needed to attack without warning.
Unrestricted submarine warfare.
Exactly. They first tried it in 1915, sank the Lusitania, caused outrage in the U.S., and backed down. But by early 1917, Germany was getting desperate. The war was dragging on, the blockade was biting hard.
So they decided to gamble.
A massive gamble. They announced they would resume unrestricted submarine warfare, sinking any ship, neutral or allied, found in the war zone around Britain. They knew this would almost certainly bring the United States into the war.
So why do it?
They calculated that they could starve Britain into submission by sinking ships faster than they could be replaced, forcing Britain out of the war before the U.S. could mobilize its army, train it, transport it across the Atlantic, and make a difference on the battlefield.
A race against time.
A desperate race against time. They thought they could win the war with the U-boats before America arrived in force.
But the gamble failed.
It failed. The U-boats initially caused huge losses, but the Allies eventually countered them effectively, mainly by adopting the convoy system.
Grouping merchant ships together with warship escorts.
Precisely. It made it much harder for U-boats to find and attack targets without being detected and counterattacked, especially once escorts got better anti-submarine weapons like depth charges and listening devices called hydrophones. The U-boat threat was contained, Britain wasn't starved out, and the U.S. entered the war.
So 1917 becomes this absolutely pivotal year. You have the U.S. entry, but also the collapse of Russia.
Right. Russia had endured staggering losses. The economy was collapsing. There were severe food shortages in the cities, and the Tsar's government had lost all authority. This led to the February Revolution in 1917, which overthrew the Tsar.
But the provisional government that took over tried to continue the war?
They did, which was a disastrous decision. The army and the country were just exhausted. This paved the way for the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, to seize power in the October Revolution, promising peace, land, and bread.
And peace meant getting out of the war.
Immediately. One of the first things the Bolsheviks did was seek an armistice with Germany. The negotiations led to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918.
Which was incredibly harsh on Russia, wasn't it?
Extremely punitive. Russia lost vast territories. Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, Ukraine, basically a huge chunk of its most valuable industrial and agricultural land. Lenin accepted the terms because he believed revolution would soon sweep Germany anyway, and he needed to consolidate Bolshevik power within Russia.
So Russia is out. This must have been a huge boost for Germany.
On paper, yes. They could finally transfer hundreds of thousands of veteran troops from the Eastern Front to the West. They no longer faced a major two-front war.
But they were racing against the clock.
Absolutely. Because the other huge event of 1917 was the United States declaring war in April.
Triggered by the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and also things like the Zimmermann telegram.
Right. The U.S. entry was a massive turning point. Not immediately in terms of troops on the ground. It took time to raise, train, and transport the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF. But psychologically and economically, it was huge.
How many troops did the U.S. mobilize?
Eventually, through the draft, the Selective Service Act, they mobilized about 2.8 million men for the AES. Just getting them equipped and shipped to France was a colossal logistical undertaking.
And the commander of the AEF, General Pershing, he had strong ideas about how his troops should fight.
He did. John J. Pershing insisted that the AEF operate as a distinct, independent American army under American command. He resisted pressure from the British and French commanders to simply feed American soldiers into their existing depleted units as replacements.
Why was that so important to him?
Pershing believed in what he called open warfare. He felt the static, attrition-based trench warfare practiced by the Allies was wrong, and that the American soldiers' natural offensive spirit was better suited to maneuver and decisive attacks. He didn't want his fresh troops ground down in the same costly stalemate.
Did that cause friction?
It certainly did. The Allies desperately needed manpower, and Pershing's insistence on training and deploying as a separate army took time. But ultimately, the arrival of this large, fresh, and independently operating American army in 1918 provided the crucial edge the Allies needed.
So Germany knows the Americans are coming in force. They have this window of opportunity after Russia's collapse.
Their last chance. They had to win the war in the West before the American presence became overwhelming. This led to the massive German spring offensive operation Michael launched in March 1918.
And initially it was incredibly successful, wasn't it?
Astonishingly successful by WWFA standards. Using new stormtrooper infiltration tactics and overwhelming artillery, they broke through the British lines and advanced up to 60 kilometers, an unheard of distance on the Western Front since 1914. It looked like they might actually win.
But they couldn't sustain it.
They couldn't. Logistics, again. The advancing German troops outran their supplies. They were moving across ground that had been utterly devastated by years of shelling, making resupply incredibly difficult. They lacked the tanks and mechanized transport to truly exploit the breakthrough. The offensive stalled, having cost Germany enormous casualties they could no longer replace.
They shot their bolt.
They basically exhausted their last reserves. And this set the stage for the Allied counteroffensive.
The 100 Days Offensive.
Starting in August 1918. Now, the Allies had the advantage. More tanks, improved artillery coordination, incorporating sound ranging and flash spotting, air superiority, and critically, the growing strength and offensive power of the American Army fighting alongside the revitalized British, French, and Dominion forces.
At this time, the German lines broke.
They started to crumble. The Battle of Amiens on August 8th was called the Black Day of the German Army by Ludendorff himself. Allied attacks were now consistently breaking through. German morale, already low after the failure of the spring offensive and years of blockade, began to collapse.
And things were falling apart for Germany's allies, too.
Yes, it became a domino effect. In late September, an Allied offensive on the Macedonian front, also called the Salonika front, broke the Bulgarian lines, the Vardar offensive. Bulgaria quickly sued for peace and capitulated on September 29th.
Cutting off the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. Isolated, facing British advances in Palestine and Mesopotamia, the Ottoman Empire signed an armistice at the end of October. Austria-Hungary, facing the Italian victory at Vittorio Veneto, and completely dissolving internally as its various nationalities declared independence, signed an armistice in early November.
So Germany was left completely alone.
Completely isolated, its army being pushed back relentlessly on the Western Front and facing collapse at home.
What happened inside Germany?
Revolution broke out. It started in early November with sailors in the ports of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven mutinying, refusing orders to sail out for a final, suicidal battle against the Royal Navy. The unrest spread rapidly. Soldiers and workers formed councils demanding peace and the Kaiser's abdication.
And the Kaiser finally went.
Yes. Facing pressure from his generals who told him the army would no longer follow him. And with revolution spreading, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated on November 9th. A republic was declared in Berlin.
And the new government immediately sought an end to the fighting.
Immediately. They signed the armistice with the Allies in a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne. It came into effect at 11:00 a.m. on November 11, 1918. The guns finally fell silent. #ChagShake7. Aftermath, consequences, and enduring legacy.
The war is over, but the world is completely changed. The immediate geopolitical impact is just enormous, isn't it?
Irreversible. 4 huge ancient empires simply ceased to exist. The Russian Romanov dynasty gone. The German Hohenzollern Empire gone. The Austro-Hungarian Habsburg Empire shattered into pieces. And the Ottoman Empire finished.
And in their place, a whole new map of Europe starts to emerge.
Based, at least in theory, on President Woodrow Wilson's principle of national self-determination. You see the birth or rebirth of independent nations like Poland, Finland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, which was formed around the core of pre-war Serbia.
Romania expanded significantly too, didn't it?
Yes, achieving Greater Romania by incorporating Romanian-speaking territories from the former Russian and Austro-Hungarian empires, the whole political geography of Central and Eastern Europe was redrawn.
But then came the peace treaties, and they were problematic, to say the least, especially the Treaty of Versailles with Germany.
Signed exactly 5 years after the assassination, June 28, 1919. Versailles is probably one of the most controversial treaties in history. And much of that controversy centers on Article 231.
The War Guilt Clause.
Right. Now, our sources make it clear Its primary purpose wasn't just moral condemnation, though it certainly felt that way to Germans.
It was more of a legal foundation.
Exactly. It required Germany to accept responsibility for all the loss and damage caused by the war, which the Allies argued was imposed upon them by German aggression. This legal acceptance of responsibility was seen as necessary to justify the massive reparations the Allies intended to demand.
But the effect in Germany was devastating.
Utterly. It caused profound humiliation and resentment across the entire political spectrum. Germans universally rejected the treaty as a dictated peace they had no say in. And that sense of injustice was immediately exploited by nationalist groups.
Fueling this stab-in-the-back myth.
Precisely. The idea that the German army hadn't actually been defeated in the field but was betrayed by weak politicians, socialists, Jews, and others on the home front who signed the armistice and the treaty. It was a corrosive lie, but incredibly potent in post-war Germany.
And the reparations themselves, the numbers were astronomical.
The final sum was set in 1921 at 132 billion gold marks, which was just an impossible figure. Even Allied experts at the time knew Germany couldn't possibly pay that much. Some sources suggest the real expectation was closer to 50 billion.
So why set the figure so high? Politics.
Largely, yes. Public opinion in Allied countries, especially France and Britain, demanded that Germany pay for the immense costs of the war. The high figure was partly symbolic, partly political appeasement.
And the way the payments were structured was also deeply flawed, wasn't it?
Critically flawed. This is where it gets fascinatingly complex and shows the long shadow. Germany couldn't pay directly from its own economy, especially after losing territory and resources under Versailles. So a system evolved, particularly under the Dawes Plan, 1924, and Young Plan, 1929.
Where the U.S. lent money to Germany.
Exactly. American banks lent huge sums to Germany. Germany used that money to make its reparation payments to the Allies, primarily France and Britain.
And what did France and Britain do with that money?
They used it to pay back their own massive war debts to the United States.
Right, so U.S. money was basically flowing in a circle. U.S. loans to Germany, German reparations to Allies, Allied debt payments back to the U.S.
That's the essence of it. A highly unstable triangle of debt and payments, completely dependent on the continued flow of American capital.
Which stopped abruptly in 1929.
When the U.S. stock market crashed and the Great Depression began, American loans dried up overnight. The entire circular system collapsed. Germany defaulted on its reparations. The Allies defaulted on their war debts. It deepened the Depression globally and fueled political extremism, especially in Germany.
But the debt didn't just vanish, did it? That detail about the final payment.
That's incredible, isn't it? Even though the reparations themselves were effectively canceled or suspended in the early 1930s, some of the underlying bonds related to the loans taken out of the Dawes and Young plans remained. Germany finally paid off the last installment of interest on those specific bonds on October 3, 2010.
2010, 92 years after the war ended. That really brings home the long-term financial consequences.
It absolutely does. Beyond finance and politics, the human cost was just immense, leaving deep social scars. France, for example, lost around 1.4 million soldiers, a huge chunk of its young male population.
And there were the severely wounded. You mentioned the Gale Cassé.
The broken faces, yes. An estimated 15,000 French soldiers suffered horrific facial disfigurements from shells, shrapnel, burns. Early plastic surgery was only just beginning. Many faced lifetimes of pain, operations, and terrible social stigma.
How did society cope with that?
It was incredibly difficult. Many were hidden away, unable or unwilling to face the public gaze. They were a brutal, visible reminder of the war's savagery, challenging the heroic narratives. Their presence forced society to confront the real cost of the conflict.
But the war also brought about some positive social changes, or at least accelerated them, like for women.
Definitely. With millions of men away fighting, women moved into the workforce in unprecedented numbers in factories, on farms, in transport, even in policing. They proved they could do the jobs previously reserved for men.
And that helped the suffrage movement.
Immensely. How could governments deny the vote to women who had played such a crucial role in the war effort? In Britain, the U.S., Germany, and many other countries, women gained the right to vote either during or shortly after the war. It was a major step forward for women's rights.
And outside Europe, the war forged new national identities, too.
Yes, particularly for the dominions of the British Empire. Gallipoli is the prime example for Australia and New Zealand.
The ANZs.
The Anzacs. Although Gallipoli was a military defeat, the immense courage and sacrifice shown by Australian and New Zealand troops fighting so far from home became a foundational myth for both nations. It was seen as their baptism of fire, the moment they stepped onto the world stage as distinct nations, not just extensions of Britain. Anzac Day, commemorating the Gallipoli landings, is still a hugely important national day in both countries. Hashtag #TagAvio. Conclusion and final thought.
So looking back across everything we've covered, if you had to distill the story of World War I, how would you frame it? It feels like a story of almost managed failure, doesn't it?
That's a good way to put it. It's a story that starts with a fragile international system built on suspicion and flawed alliances. Then a diplomatic crisis that wasn't contained, but actively escalated.
Leading to a war defined by technology outpacing tactics, causing unimaginable slaughter.
Exactly. And ending with a peace treaty that, while redrawing the map, was so punitive and poorly designed that it arguably sowed the seeds for the next World War just 20 years later.
It's why historians sometimes struggle with WWI, isn't it? As one source noted, it often lacks that clear good versus evil narrative that many people see in World War II.
Right. It feels more like a catastrophic, almost systemic failure. A tragedy born out of miscalculation, nationalism, imperialism, and a failure of diplomacy on all sides. It's morally complex and deeply unsettling.
And the unsettling part isn't just historical. There's a final thought, a really stark reminder that the war isn't entirely over, even today.
You mean the physical remnants?
Yeah. The effects are literally still in the ground in France and Belgium.
The iron harvest. It's astonishing. Every year, farmers in the old battlefield areas still plow up tons of unexploded ordnance, shells, grenades, mortars, sometimes chemical munitions.
Still dangerous after more than a century.
Absolutely deadly. Bomb disposal teams are constantly at work. People are still killed or injured by WWI explosives every few years.
And it's not just the explosives. The land itself is scarred.
Deeply scarred. Some areas, particularly around Verdun, were so saturated with chemical residues and heavy metals from the millions upon millions of shells fired that the soil remains poisoned. Sources indicate that even now, over 100 years later, the original biodiversity hasn't returned. Certain zones are still considered unsuitable for normal agriculture or habitation.
So the final thought for you, our listener, is this. What does it really mean for a war to be over?
When its physical legacy, the unexploded bombs still waiting beneath the soil, the poisoned earth that struggles to recover continues to shape the landscape and even pose a threat to life, more than a century after the armistice. It makes you think about the true, lasting cost of conflict.
A powerful and sobering thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on The Deep Dive.
We'll see you next time.